Mason Reed was checking his fence line when he saw the burlap sack floating by Miller's Creek. He thought it was just old rags until a tiny hand reached out and a voice barely louder than a whisper said, "Mama." What he pulled from that sack would change everything. The morning sun was just breaking over the Texas hills when Mason Reed saddled up his old horse, Thunder. It was going to be another long day of checking fence posts and mending wire on the Double Bar Ranch. At 45 years old, Mason had been doing this same routine for over a decade now. Ever since he lost everything that mattered to him, his wife Emily and their baby son had died in a house fire 10 years ago. And Mason had never been the same. He kept to himself, worked hard, and tried not to think about what his life could have been. Mason was a tall man with weathered hands and kind eyes that had seen too much pain. The other ranch hands respected him, but knew better than to get too close. He had built walls around his heart so thick that nothing could get through. Or so, he thought. As he rode along the creek that morning, checking for breaks in the fence, he noticed something floating in the slow-moving water. At first, he figured it was just trash that had washed down from upstream. People were always throwing their old stuff in the creek, and it usually ended up caught in the branches along his section of the ranch. But something about this particular bundle made him stop. It was a burlap sack, the kind used for feed, but it was moving slightly in the current. Mason dismounted and waded into the shallow water to get a better look. The sack was tied at the top with rough rope, and it was heavier than he expected. As he lifted it from the water, he heard something that made his blood run cold. It was the faintest sound, barely audible over the babbling creek. A whimper, a cry so weak it could have been mistaken for the wind. Mason's hands shook as he carefully untied the rope. What he saw inside that wet, dirty sack would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was a baby girl, maybe 8 or 10 months old, with matted blonde hair and blue lips. Her tiny body was cold as ice and she was barely breathing. But when she saw Mason's face looking down at her, she opened her eyes and whispered the word that broke his heart into 1,000,000 pieces. Mama. For a moment, Mason couldn't move. He just stood there in the creek holding this dying child, remembering his own baby who had called out for him in those final moments 10 years ago. But this time was different. This time he could do something. This baby was alive, and she needed him. Mason quickly wrapped the little girl in his heavy coat and climbed back onto Thunder. He had never ridden so fast in his life. The baby was getting weaker by the minute. Her breathing was shallow and her skin was turning blue from the cold. Mason pressed her close to his chest, trying to share his body heat as Thunder galloped toward town. "Hold on, little one," he whispered. "Just hold on." The baby's tiny fingers gripped his shirt, and she looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for such a small face. She was fighting to stay alive, and Mason was going to make sure she won that fight. As they rode into town, Mason's mind was racing. Who could do such a thing to an innocent child? What kind of monster puts a baby in a sack and throws her in a creek to die? But there would be time for those questions later. Right now, the only thing that mattered was getting this little girl to Dr. Michael Stone's office. Mason had never been much of a praying man, but he found himself begging God to let them make it in time. The baby's eyes fluttered closed just as Mason reached Main Street. For a terrifying moment, he thought he was too late, but then she took another breath and her little hand tightened around his finger. She was still fighting. Mason kicked Thunder's sides one more time and raced toward the doctor's office at the end of the street. People stopped what they were doing to stare at the wilder-looking cowboy racing through town with something bundled in his coat. But Mason didn't care about anything except the precious life in his arms. Dr. Stone's office sat on the corner of Main and Church Street, a small white building with a red cross painted on the door. Mason had only been there once before when he gotten kicked by a horse and needed stitches. He never liked doctors much, but Dr. Stone had a reputation for being good with children. Mason prayed that reputation was true as he slid down from Thunder's back and ran toward the door. The baby was so still now that Mason had to put his ear close to her mouth to make sure she was still breathing. Her breath was warm against his cheek, and he felt a surge of hope. She was alive. She was going to make it. She had to make it. Because in the space of 20 minutes, this abandoned child had already begun to heal something in Mason's broken heart that he thought was dead forever. As Mason burst through Dr. Stone's door with a dying child, he had no idea that this moment would put him on a collision course with the most powerful family in town, and a secret that could destroy them all. Dr. Michael Stone looked up from his morning coffee when Mason Reed burst through his office door like a man possessed. The cowboy's face was pale as winter frost, and he was clutching something wrapped in his coat like his life depended on it. "Doc, you got to help," Mason gasped, his chest heaving from the hard ride into town. "I found her in the creek. She's barely breathing." Dr. Stone had been practicing medicine in this small Texas town for 20 years, and he'd seen plenty of emergencies. But when Mason unwrapped that tiny bundle and revealed the half-dead baby girl, even the experienced doctor felt his stomach drop. The child was blue around the lips, her skin cold as marble, and her breathing so shallow it was barely visible. "Get her on a table now," Dr. Stone commanded, his gentle bedside manner replaced by urgent professionalism. Mason laid the baby down carefully, his big hands surprisingly tender as he smoothed her matted hair. The little girl's eyes fluttered open for just a moment as she made a soft, whimpering sound that cut straight through both men's hearts. "How long was she in the water?" Dr. Stone asked, already reaching for his stethoscope and warming blankets. Mason shook his head, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know. Document. Could have been minutes or hours. She was tied up in a feed sack and just floating there like garbage. The next hour was the longest of Mason's life." Dr. Stone worked with the focused intensity of a man fighting death itself. He wrapped the baby in heated blankets, checked her temperature, listened to her tiny heart, and carefully examined every inch of her small body for injuries. Mason refused to leave, pacing the small office like a caged animal, jumping at every sound the baby made. "She's hypothermic," Dr. Stone explained as he worked. "Her body temperature is dangerously low and she's dehydrated, but she's a fighter. I can tell already." It was during this crisis that Grace Harper arrived. The 35-year-old schoolteacher had been walking past the doctor's office on her way to the general store when she heard the commotion inside. Grace was known throughout town as a kind woman who kept to herself since losing her husband in a mining accident 5 years ago. What most people didn't know was that Grace had also lost a baby daughter to fever just 6 months old. She'd sworn never to hold another child again. The pain was too deep. "Dr. Stone, is everything all right?" Grace asked, poking her head through the door. When she saw the tiny baby on the examination table, her hand flew to her throat. For a moment she couldn't breathe. The child looked so small, so helpless, just like her own daughter had been. "Grace, thank goodness," Dr. Stone said without looking up from his patient. "I need your help. This baby needs constant care, and I have other patients to see. You're the only woman in town I trust with something this delicate." Grace wanted to run. Every instinct told her to turn around and walk away before her heart could break all over again. But when the baby opened her eyes and looked directly at her, Grace felt something she thought was dead forever stir in her chest. "What? What happened to her?" she asked, stepping closer to spite her fear. Mason spoke up from his corner, his voice rough with anger. "Someone put her in a sack and threw her in Miller's Creek to die. What kind of monster does that to a baby?" Dr. Stone had managed to stabilize the child's temperature, and her breathing was becoming stronger by the hour. "She's going to need round-the-clock care for the next few days," he explained to Grace, feeding every 2 hours, keeping her warm, watching for any signs of pneumonia or fever. "I can't do it alone, and Mason here looks like he hasn't slept in a week." Mason bristled at the suggestion that he couldn't handle it, but one look at his shaking hands told the truth. He was terrified of doing something wrong. Grace found herself nodding before she could stop herself. "I'll help," she whispered, and immediately wondered if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. But when Dr. Stone placed the baby in her arms for the first time, something magical happened. The child, who had been restless and fussy, immediately calmed down. Her tiny hand wrapped around Grace's finger, and she made a soft, cooping sound. That was the most beautiful music Grace had ever heard. Mason watched in amazement as Grace began to hum softly, a lullaby that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her memory. The baby's eyes grew heavy, and for the first time since being pulled from the creek, she smiled. It was just a tiny upturn of her lips, but it was enough to bring tears to both adults' eyes. "She likes you," Mason said softly, and Grace nodded, not trusting her voice to speak. Over the next 3 days, Mason and Grace took turns caring for the baby. Mason learned to change diapers with his clumsy cowboy hands, and Grace showed him how to test the temperature of formula on his wrist. They barely spoke to each other at first, both too afraid of getting too attached to this child who might be taken away at any moment. But gradually, as they watched the baby grow stronger, they began to open up. "I had a daughter once," Grace admitted on the second night as she fed the baby by lamplight. "She would have been about 5 now if she'd lived." Mason nodded, understanding. Her pain better than most. "I lost a son," he said quietly. "House fire 10 years ago. I thought I'd never want to be around children again, but this little one, she's different." The baby finished her bottle and reached up toward Grace's face, her tiny fingers touching the tears. Grace didn't know she was crying. It was Grace who first called her Hope. "She needs a name," Grace said on the 3rd morning, as the baby babbled happily in her makeshift crib. "We can't keep calling her the baby. Look at those eyes. She seemed the worst this world has to offer, but she's still fighting. She's still hoping for better days." Mason smiled, the first real, a smile anyone had seen from him in years. "Hope," he repeated. "I like that. Hope it is." The baby seemed to respond to her new name, turning her head when they called her Hope, and even attempting what sounded like Mama when Grace held her. Dr. Stone was amazed at her recovery. "I've never seen anything like it," he told them. "Yesterday, she was a death's door, and now look at her. It's like she knows she's loved, and she was loved more than any of them had expected." Grace had lost her fear of attachment, and Mason had found a purpose he'd thought was gone forever. Hope had just taken her first solid food in Grace's arms, managing to swallow a few spoonfuls of mashed vegetables without spitting him up. When Sheriff Williams burst through the door with news that made everyone's blood run cold. "Someone's been asking questions about a missing baby," he announced, his face grim. "They're offering a $1,000 reward for information. Whoever abandoned this child, they're looking for her." Sheriff Williams closed the door behind him and pulled up a chair. His weathered face was serious as he looked at Mason, Grace, and little Hope sleeping peacefully in Grace's arms. "I've been doing some digging," he said quietly. "This wasn't an accident. Someone deliberately put that baby in the creek. And now they're trying to cover their tracks." Mason's jaw tightened. "What kind of person does that? And then comes looking for the evidence?" Grace pulled Hope closer, her protective instincts flaring. "They're not getting her back," she whispered, fiercely. "I don't care who they are." Sheriff Williams held up his hand. "Now hold on. We don't know who they are yet. All I know is that Mayor Thornton's assistant came by my office yesterday asking if anyone had found a missing infant. Said it was a family matter that needed to be handled quietly." The mention of Mayor Thornton's name made everyone in the room tense. Richard Thornton was the wealthiest, most powerful man in 3 counties. He owned a bank, the largest ranch, and half the businesses in town. When Thornton wanted something done, it got done, no questions asked. "What did you tell him?" Mason asked. Sheriff Williams shrugged. "I told him I hadn't heard anything about a missing baby. Technically true. Since Hope here wasn't missing, she was abandoned." Over the next few days, word spread through town about Mason and Grace's unusual living arrangement. Some folks thought it was sweet, watching the gruff cowboy learn to be gentle with a baby, while the quiet schoolteacher came back to life, caring for little Hope. But others whispered behind closed doors about propriety and what it meant for an unmarried man and woman to be raising a child together, even temporarily. Grace tried to ignore the gossip, but it was hard when women stopped talking whenever she'd walk into the general store. "Let them talk," Mason said one evening as he watched Grace give Hope her bottle. They don't know what they're talking about, but Grace could see the worry in his eyes. They both knew their arrangement was fragile, built on nothing but love for a child who wasn't legally theirs. It was Maria Gonzalez who finally brought them the truth. The mayor's housemaid had worked for the Thornon family for 15 years, cleaning their big house and keeping their secrets. But this secret was eating her alive. She found Grace at the schoolhouse one afternoon, wringing her hands and speaking in rapid whispers. "I cannot stay quiet anymore," Maria said, tears streaming down her face. "That baby, she belongs to Miss Rebecca, the mayor's daughter." Grace felt her world tilt. Rebecca Thornon was 19 years old, the mayor's pride and joy. She'd been sent away to visit relatives 6 months ago, and no one had seen her since. "Rebecca had a baby?" Grace asked, though the pieces were already falling into place. Maria nodded miserably. "The family, they were so ashamed. A baby with no husband. It would ruin their name. They sent Miss Rebecca away and told everyone she was getting an education back east." The full horror of the situation became clear as Maria continued. "The mayor, he told his daughter the baby died during birth. Miss Rebecca, she cried for weeks thinking her child was dead, but the baby lived. And the mayor, he paid a man to take care of the problem. I heard them talking. They said the baby would be better off dead than growing up with the shame." Mason felt sick to his stomach, so they had Hope thrown in the creek to die. And now they're looking for her because they're afraid someone might connect her to their family. Maria nodded. The mayor's worried. Too many people asking questions about Miss Rebecca, about where she really went. If people find out about the baby, Grace looked down at Hope, who was babbling happily and trying to grab at Grace's hair. In just 1 week, this child had become the center of her world. The idea of giving her back to people who had tried to kill her was unthinkable. "They're not taking her," Grace said firmly. Mason nodded his agreement over my dead body. But even as they made their vows to protect Hope, they all knew the truth. When Mayor Thornton wanted something, he usually got it. He had money, power, an influence that reached every corner of their small town. What did they have? Just love. And sometimes love wasn't enough to win against power. Hope had begun calling Grace Mama, clearly now, and when Mason held her, she would pat his cheek and babble what sounded like Papa. She was thriving under their care, growing stronger and happier every day. The thought of losing her was breaking both their hearts before the fight even began. As the sun set that evening, Grace tucked Hope in her crib and sang the lullaby that always made the baby smile. But her happiness was overshadowed by fear. Maria's confession was just the beginning, and they all knew it. Mayor Thornton's carriage had been seen heading toward town that morning, and Grace realized they were about to face the fight of their lives for the child who had already stolen their hearts. Mayor Richard Thornton arrived at Dr. Stone's office in his finest black carriage, pulled by 2 matching horses that cost more than most people in town made in a year. He was a large man with silver hair and cold gray eyes that were used to getting their way. Behind him stepped a young woman with tears streaming down her face. Rebecca Thornton looked nothing like the confident mayor's daughter people remembered. She was thin, pale, and her hands shook as she approached the building. Mason stood up when they entered, instinctively moving between the Thorntons and Grace, who was holding Hope. The baby was playing with Grace's necklace, completely unaware that her world was about to be turned upside down. "Mr. Reed," Mayor Thornton said in his commanding voice, "I believe you have something that belongs to my family. I have a baby who is left to die in Miller's Creek," Mason replied evenly. "If she belongs to anyone, it's to the people who saved her life." Mayor Thornton's eyes flashed with anger. He wasn't used to being challenged by ranch hands. "That child is my granddaughter. She belongs with her family where she can have a proper upbringing, education, and all the advantages my money can provide. Grace felt hope stiffen in her arms as the mayor's loud voice filled the small room. The baby turned away from the strangers and buried her face against Grace's shoulder, whimpering softly. "She doesn't know you," Grace said quietly. "Look at her. She's afraid." Rebecca stepped forward then, her voice barely a whisper. "May I? May I hold her?" Grace hesitated, then slowly approached Rebecca. But when she tried to transfer her hope to her birth mother's arms, the baby began to cry. Not the soft whimpering they'd heard when she was sick, but the desperate, heartbroken wails of a child who was terrified. Hope reached frantically for Grace, her small fist grabbing at Grace's dress as she sobbed, "Mama! Mama!" Rebecca's face crumpled as her own daughter rejected her touch. "She doesn't know me," Rebecca whispered, the words breaking her heart. "My own baby doesn't know me." She looked at her father with pain and anger in her eyes. "You told me she died. You let me grieve for months while she was alive." Mayor Thornton's jaw tightened. "I did what was best for this family. You were 19 and unmarried. The scandal would have destroyed us all." He turned to Mason and Grace with authority. "But now we can fix this. The child will come home with us where she belongs. I've already spoken with Judge Parker. Family rights supersede any temporary arrangements." Mason stepped forward, his hands clenched in fists. "You threw this baby away like garbage. You paid someone to kill her. Now you want her back because you're worried about your reputation." His voice was rising with every word. "She's not property. She's a little girl who's been loved and cared for. And she's happy." "Happy?" Mayor Thornton scoffed. "Living in poverty with people who have no legal claim to her. I can give her everything. A mansion, private tutors, the finest clothes, and a future most children can only dream of." Grace held Hope tighter as the baby continued to reach for her, still crying softly. "She has love," Grace said simply. "That's worth more than all your money." Rebecca was staring at Hope with a mixture of longing and heartbreak. "I want her back," she said suddenly. "She's my daughter. I gave birth to her. I carried her for 9 months. I have rights too." But even as she spoke the words, her voice lacked conviction. Hope was still clinging to Grace, calling her mama between her tears. Dr. Stone had been quietly observing from a corner. "The child has clearly formed strong attachments," he said professionally. "Removing her from the only caregivers she's known could cause serious emotional trauma." Mayor Thornton waved his hand dismissively. "Children adapt. She's young enough to forget these people and bond with her real family." "We are her real family," Mason said fiercely. "We're the ones who saved her life, who stayed up all night when she was sick, who taught her to smile again. Blood doesn't make a family. Love does." The room fell silent except for Hope's soft whimpers as she nestled against Grace's neck. Mayor Thornton pulled out a legal document from his coat. "Judge Parker will hear this case in 3 days. I suggest you enjoy what time you have left with the child." He looked at his daughter sternly. "Rebecca, we're leaving. You've seen the baby. Now, let's go home and prepare for the custody hearing." As the Thorns left, Rebecca turned back one more time. Hope had stopped crying and was looking at her with curious blue eyes. "I love you," Rebecca whispered to her daughter, "even if you don't know it yet." But as she reached out her hand, Hope turned away and snuggled closer to Grace. That night, as Grace tucked Hope in her crib, the baby was unusually clingy. She didn't want Grace to leave, reaching out whenever Grace tried to step away. "It's okay, sweetheart," Grace whispered, smoothing Hope's soft hair. "Mama's not going anywhere." But as she said the words, Grace whispered a secret that would change everything. "I have something that might save us all, something I never told anyone about Rebecca's father." The courthouse had never been so packed. It seemed like half the town had shown up to see what would happen to little Hope. Judge Parker, a fair man in his 60s with kind eyes and gray hair, looked out over the crowded room and banged his gavel. "This is a custody hearing, not a circus," he announced. "I'll have order. I'll clear this courtroom." Mayor Thornton sat at the front table with his expensive lawyer from Dallas, a sharp-dressed man who looked like he could argue the devil out of his pitchfork. Rebecca sat beside them, nervous and pale, twisting her hands in her lap. Across the aisle, Mason and Grace sat with Tom Bradley, the town's only other lawyer who usually handled wills and property disputes. Between them sat Hope in Grace's arms, playing quietly with a wooden toy Mason had carved for her. "Your Honor," the Dallas lawyer began, standing with confidence, "this is a simple matter of family rights. My client, Mr. Richard Thornton, is seeking custody of his granddaughter, who rightfully belongs with her blood relatives. The child's mother, Miss Rebecca Thornton, is prepared to raise her daughter with all the advantages their prominent family can provide." Judge Parker nodded and made note. "And what is the family's position on how the child came to be found in Miller's Creek?" The lawyer's confident expression flickered slightly. "There was a tragic misunderstanding, Your Honor. The family believed the child had died at birth. When they learned she was alive, they immediately sought to reclaim her." Mason's lawyer stood up next. Tom Bradley might not have been fancy, but he knew right from wrong. "Your Honor, this misunderstanding nearly cost an innocent baby her life. My clients found this child abandoned in a creek, left to die. They saved her, nursed her back to health, and have provided her with love and care for weeks now. The child clearly sees them as her parents." As if to prove his point, Hope looked up at Grace and said clearly, "Mama," then turned to Mason and patted his hand, babbling happily. Several people in the courtroom smiled at the sweet moment, but Mayor Thornton's face remained stone cold. The Dallas lawyer called his first witness. "I'd like to call Rebecca Thornton." To the stand. Rebecca walked slowly to the witness chair, her hands shaking as she was sworn in. "Miss Thornton," the lawyer said gently, "please tell the court about your relationship to this child." "She's my daughter," Rebecca said quietly. "I gave birth to her 9 months ago. I thought she had died. My father told me there were complications and that she didn't survive." Tears began rolling down her cheeks. "I grieve for her. I named her Emma after my grandmother. I never stopped loving her, even when I thought she was gone." "And now that you know she's alive, what do you want?" the lawyer asked. Rebecca looked across the courtroom at Hope, who was contentedly playing in Grace's lap. "I want to be her mother. I want to give her everything I couldn't before. I'm older now, more mature. I could take care of her." Tom Bradley stood for cross-examination. "Miss Thornton, in all these weeks since the child was found, how many times have you visited her?" Rebecca's voice was barely a whisper. "This is the first time I've seen her since she was born." Tom nodded sympathetically. "And when he tried to hold her yesterday, what happened?" She cried. Rebecca admitted fresh tears starting. "She didn't want to hold her. She reached for the other woman and called her mama. Her voice broke completely. She doesn't know me. My own daughter doesn't know me." Next, Mason took the stand. His hands were steady as he was sworn in, but his voice was thick with emotion as he spoke. "Your Honor, I know I'm just a ranch hand. I don't have money or fancy education, but I know what it means to love a child. I lost my own son 10 years ago, and I thought that part of my heart was dead forever. Then I found Hope in that creek, barely alive, and everything changed." He looked directly at Judge Parker. "She was dying, sir. Blue lips, couldn't breathe, cold as ice. But she fought to live, and we fought to save her. Grace and we've been up with her every night, fed her every meal, taught her to laugh again. She calls me Papa now, and every time she does, it fills a hole in my heart I thought would never heal." The Dallas lawyer tried to shake Mason's testimony. Mr. agreed. "You have no legal claim to this child, correct?" Mason nodded. "That's right. But love doesn't need papers, sir. Hope knows who her real parents are, and it's not the people who try to kill her." Grace's testimony was the most powerful of all. She spoke about losing her own daughter, about being afraid to love again, and about how hope had brought her back to life. "I teach children every day," she said, "and I've never seen a happier, more secure child than Hope. She's not just surviving, she's thriving. She's learned to walk, to say words, to trust that when she needs someone, we'll be there." Then Grace dropped her bombshell. "Your Honor, I taught Rebecca when she was in school. I know this family. I know why she ran away from home, and it wasn't to get an education." She looked directly at Mayor Thornton. "Rebecca came to me 2 years ago, scared and covered in bruises. Her father had been hitting her, controlling every part of her life. She was afraid to tell anyone because of his power in this town." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Mayor Thornton shot to his feet. "That's a lot." But Rebecca was sobbing, nodding her head. "It's true," she whispered. "He hit me when I told him about the baby. Call me a disgrace to the family name." Grace continued, her voice strong and clear. "I offered to help Rebecca then, and I'm offering again now, not to take her daughter away, but to help her become the mother she wants to be, but only if she truly wants to be a mother. Not just for claim property for her father's reputation." Judge Parker called for recess, and as the courtroom began to empty, something magical happened. Hope had been getting fussy during the long proceedings, but suddenly she stood up unsteadily in Grace's lap. With everyone watching, she took her first wobbly steps, walking straight into Mason's outstretched arms while calling Papa. "Papa!" The entire courtroom fell silent at the beautiful moment. But Judge Parker's decision would determine if this was a beginning or a heartbreaking goodbye. Judge Parker returned to his bench after what felt like the longest hour in courthouse history. The packed room held its breath as he adjusted his glasses and looked out over the crowd. Hope sat quietly in Grace's lap, playing with the wooden horse Mason had carved for her, completely unaware that her entire future hung in the balance. "I've been a judge for 30 years, Judge Parker began, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "And I've never had a case that so clearly shows the difference between what's legal and what's right." He looked first at Mayor Thornton, then at Mason and Grace. "The law says blood relatives have rights, but the law also says we must act in the best interest of the child." Mayor Thornton leaned forward in his chair, confident that money and influence would win the day. But Judge Parker wasn't finished. "I've heard testimony about abandonment, about a child left to die in a creek. I've heard about abuse, about control, about a young woman too scared to speak up for herself. And I've seen something else. I watched a baby take her first steps toward the people she calls Mama and Papa." The judge's voice grew stronger. "This court finds that Hope Red, and yes, I'm using the name her caregivers gave her, belongs with Mason Reed and Grace Harper. They have provided her with love, stability, and security. More importantly, she has chosen them as clearly as any child can." The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. Mayor Thornton jumped to his feet, his face red with rage. "This is outrageous. You can't give my granddaughter to strangers." But his protest fell on deaf ears. The town's people had heard enough about his treatment of Rebecca, and many were already getting up to congratulate Mason and Grace. Rebecca sat quietly for a moment, tears streaming down her face. But these weren't tears of anger or loss. They were tears of relief. She stood up slowly and walked over to where Grace was holding Hope. "May I say goodbye?" she asked softly. Grace nodded and gently lifted Hope so Rebecca could see her face. "I love you, Emma," Rebecca whispered, using the name she had chosen for her daughter. "I want you to be happy more than I want you to be." "With me. These people saved your life and they'll give you all the love I wish I could." Hope looked at Rebecca with curious eyes and reached out to touch her face as if she sensed the importance of the moment. Rebecca turned to Grace and Mason. "I want to be part of her life if you'll let me. Not as her mother. You've earned that title. But maybe as someone who visits, someone who cares about her. I like to watch her grow up and know she's loved." Grace took Rebecca's hand. "Of course, Hope should know her story, all of it. You'll always be welcome in our home." 6 months later, the whole town gathered for Mason and Grace's wedding. It was a simple ceremony held in the church on Main Street, but it was filled with more love than many grand weddings in big cities. Hope, now walking confidently and chattering non-stop, served as their flower girl. She wore a white dress that Grace had sewn herself and carried a basket of wild flowers that Mason had helped her pick. When the preacher asked if anyone objected to the union, Hope shouted out, "Mama, Papa!" and clapped her hands, making everyone laugh. It was the perfect seal of approval from the little girl who had brought them all together. Rebecca sat in the third row, smiling through happy tears as she watched her daughter celebrate with her chosen family. The reception was held at the church hall, and as Mason and Grace danced their first dance as husband and wife, Hope toddled around the floor between them, holding onto Grace's dress and trying to keep up with the music. It was a picture of pure happiness that no one who saw would ever forget. As the years passed, Hope thrived in ways no one could have imagined. She grew into a confident, loving child who knew her story and wasn't ashamed of it. When people asked about her real parents, she would point to Mason and Grace without hesitation. "These are my real mama and papa," she would say with absolute certainty. "They chose me when everyone else said no." Rebecca kept her promise to visit regularly. She finished her education, became a teacher like Grace, and eventually found the courage to stand up to her father. Mayor Thornton never regained the respect he had lost in the community, and several families moved their business elsewhere. He lived the rest of his days knowing that his cruelty had cost him his granddaughter's love. The man who had been paid to abandon Hope was found and arrested within a year. His name was Carl Jenkins, and guilt had been eating him alive since that terrible day at the creek. I heard her crying in that sack, he confessed to Sheriff Williams. I knew it was wrong, but the mayor paid me good money and said it was for the best. I've been haunted by that baby's voice ever since. On Hope's 5th birthday, the whole town came to celebrate. She sat at the head of the table, surrounded by her parents, her birth mother, who she now called Aunt Rebecca, Dr. Stone, who had saved her life, and dozens of friends who had watched her grow. When someone asked her to make a wish before blowing out her candles, Hope looked around at all the faces smiling back at her. "I don't need to wish for anything," she said in her clear, confident voice. "I already have everything. I have a mama and papa who love me, and I have all of you. What more could anyone want?" As she blew out her candles, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. That night, as Grace tucked Hope into bed, the little girl asked the question she asked every night. "Mama, tell me the story about how you and Papa found me." Grace smiled and began the familiar tale. Once upon a time, there was a brave cowboy who heard a tiny voice calling for help by the creek, and Hope would fall asleep every night knowing she was exactly where she belonged, surrounded by love, chosen by hearts that refused to give up on her, and blessed with a family that proved love is always stronger than